Trae Young is one of my favorite players. I hated on him when he first arrived in the league, but over the years he has gradually lured me to the Hawks side. The next level passing, the absurd handles, the insane shooting, and the swagger. The nickname, giving the entire state of New York 3 years worth of PTSD. It was just hard for me to hate on the dude, and even if you hate on him, it's impossible to overlook his talent. When just looking at him from a talent perspective, he has all the tools to be one of the best players in the league. All of them except one. The man is 6'2" in platforms and 170 pounds soaking wet. By NBA standards, he is the proverbial mouse in the house, and there have not been a lot of mice, historically speaking, that have led their teams to wins. I've already gone over this phenomenon in previous videos, how the only small players to lead their teams to a championship since the year 1980 are Stephen Curry, Dwayne Wade, and the original Isaiah Thomas. But let's dive a little deeper, because just speaking candidly, there are not a lot of teams that are absolutely dying to win a championship. Every organization would love a championship, don't get me wrong. If you're offering up a Larry O'Brien on a platter, no questions asked, there is no team that's just gonna cuss you out and yell at you to get off their lawn. But I would wager that a majority of front offices and owners settle for just being a consistent threat in the playoffs, just enough to keep the fan base engaged throughout the entirety of the season. Hey guys, this could be our year type of teams. So let's expand our criteria a little bit. How many players since the year 1980 were able to lead their teams to a conference finals appearance? Not even a win, just an appearance. How many players 6'4" and under were good enough to lead their teams to the Final Four? 13. 13 names. Sidney Moncrief, the original Isaiah Thomas, Allen Iverson, Jason Kidd, Dwayne Wade, Derrick Rose, the 2010s Isaiah Thomas, Gus Williams, Otis Songberg, Kevin Johnson, Steve Nash, Stephen Curry, and Gary the Glove Payton. So depending on how you feel about that list, you got 13-ish of the best pound-for-pound players in the history of the NBA. Awesome! How did they win? That's the question we need to answer for Trae, right? How were these teams able to overcome the significant disadvantage their top dogs were under in this league we love so much? How were these teams able to use these Davids to compete with Goliaths? How did these teams win, and how can we replicate it on the Atlanta Hawks? Well, when you go through each of these 13 players and the teams that got them to that illustrious Final Four, two trends start to emerge. Trend number 1. The David in question is usually elite at least two things. For a majority of these players, 90s Isaiah, Nash, Kevin Johnson, they were elite at scoring and playmaking. For players like Kidd, Wade, the Glove, Sidney Moncrief, they combined their offensive talent with world-class defense. And then for players like Curry and Iverson, they were elite at both on-ball and off-ball scoring. Why does this trend exist? Because I believe the most important trait for any team to have in the playoffs is something I have mentioned in previous videos: versatility. When playing against another team 7 times in 2 weeks, when they finally figure out how to stop your initial game plan, are you versatile enough to switch to a different game plan to counteract your opponent's adjustments? If your player is both short and only really good at one thing, then the answer is probably no. Let's look at scoring, for instance. Say your team is built around prime Bradley Beal, 31 points per game, real deal Beal, one of the best scorers of the 2020s. When a team in a 7-game series figures out how to stop Beal on the perimeter, what's your next move? He's a good, not great playmaker, so it'll be tough for him to transition completely into that point guard role like a prime CP3. He's not a great defender, so he doesn't provide a lot of value on the other end of the court like an Anthony Edwards, and he's not big enough to be a screener or post-up player. This is the main reason why it's okay for bigger players, i.e. Carmelo Anthony, to be a bit more one-dimensional, because they are at least big enough to score in different ways: on ball, in the post, as the screener, etc. Small players don't have that same luxury. They can't just be good at scoring. When a team figures out how to stop your best player scoring or your best player's passing or anything your best player does, are they able to provide superstar value in another facet of the game? This is the main crux of what I think makes the best playoff performers the best. And because our Davids don't have the size to easily score in multiple different ways, their skill sets often have to be a bit more diverse. This bodes well for Trae Young because he just happens to be one of the best passers and scorers in the league. Number 2, the second trend. The second thing almost every team led to the conference finals by a small player has: a top 5 defense. And if it's not top 5, then it's pretty darn close. What does this mean to you? Because to me, it signals that the best way to build a team around a small player is with primarily defensive personnel. And when I contemplate reasons as to why this may be true, I arrive at this conclusion. No matter how good your small player is defensively, if they are under 6'4", then they are inherently more susceptible to being a liability on that end of the court. Stephen Curry has been a decent C+ defender for most of his career, but because he is an undersized guard, he gets matchup hunted in the playoffs like he's straight up bad. Thus, to have a good defense with an undersized player, you need to make sure that everyone else on the team is at least decent defensively, so you don't have 2 liabilities on the court at any one time. Okay, but if you're focusing so much on defense, where does the offense come in? Well, hopefully your best player, that small player, most likely a point guard, is good enough offensively to make up for some of his teammates' limitations. This is probably why a lot of these David-led teams that had elite defenses tended to have offenses that capped out around 10th. I kind of think of it like my Chiefs this year. Patrick Mahomes is the best player in the league, but he obviously can't do anything to affect his defense. So it makes the most sense to invest completely in your defense so that it's a top 3 unit. Leave the offensive cupboards a little bare and just pray that one of the best QBs in the history of the league can carry that offense to around league average. Philadelphia in 2000-2001 is the perfect basketball example of what I'm talking about. Allen Iverson is not doing anything for you defensively. He is one of the best scorers of all time though. So just surround the man with a bunch of defensive personnel so you are top 5 on that side of the ball, and then on the other side of the ball, run everything through Iverson and let him carry you to a top 15-ish offense. Real quick disclaimer, I don't want to make it sound like you can just surround your best player with 5 Andre Robersons and expect to make it to the conference finals. I don't want to make it sound like that because he does still need some help on the offensive end of the court. I'm merely saying that when you're choosing between strictly offense and strictly defensive personnel, you want to have players that lean a little closer to the defensive side of the ball. Okay. What about if you aren't able to surround your best player with 4 good defensive starters? Scrap defense altogether. It's probably not going to be good anyways. Lean all the way into offense. The only way your team will be able to make the conference finals without a top 10 defense is to have a top 3 offense. The issue with that though is that these offense first, small player led teams that make the final 4, they are usually the one and dones. They usually only make the conference finals once and never return. The exception to this rule is the 2000s Phoenix Suns with Steve Nash at the helm. And not to take anything away from Steve Nash, 2-time MVP and a first ballot Hall of Famer, but he did have one of the most underrated players of the 2000s in Amare Stoudemire by him. Now, I don't bring up Amare to cast aspersions on Nash's name. I merely bring it up to show that even though Nash's Suns were clearly his team, clearly a David-led team, Steve had a more than adequate Goliath by his side to help him navigate the Giants. The only other offense first, David-led teams did not have a Hall of Fame big on the roster and only made the conference finals one time apiece. Those 2 teams are the 2010s Portland Trail Blazers with Dame Time, and yes, the 2020s Atlanta Hawks. Yes, I tricked you. That 13-name list is actually 14 names long. Trae Young has made the conference finals before, so what are we getting on about? Why go through all this hoopla? He's made the Final 4 before, so just do the same thing again, right? Well, that right there is the reason I went through all this hoopla, as you put it, dear viewer, to show you that I am a little bit worried that if the Atlanta Hawks continue to construct this bottom 15 defensive roster around Trae, that first conference finals appearance 2 years ago will be his only conference finals appearance. I'm a little bit worried that that first conference finals appearance was a tad bit flukish, mainly due to luck of the draw. The Hawks, on their way to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2021, faced off against a pre-Jalen Brunson Knicks and a Ben Simmons, Doc Rivers-led Philly team. Don't get me wrong, still playoff teams, but look at who was on the other side of the bracket. The champion Milwaukee Bucks, the Nets with Ultra Instinct KD, prime heat culture Miami coming off an NBA Finals berth, and the Boston Celtics. Now look at who the Hawks lost to in the first round the 2 following years with a roster of similar-ish talent level. 2022, lost in the first round to the Miami Heat. 2023, lost in the first round to the Boston Celtics. So yes, while the 2021 Atlanta Hawks were one of the final 2 teams in the East, I don't believe they were one of the 2 best teams in the conference. I think they got lucky with the way the bracket shook out and the teams they had to play against, and thus had a much easier path than teams I thought were actually better than them, such as the Brooklyn Nets. So the Atlanta Hawks can continue to build their roster in similar ways to that conference finals team, but I think using that team as a blueprint is wrong because they weren't as good as we think they are. They just got a little bit lucky. If the Hawks truly want to build a David-led team that makes it to the conference finals, that isn't at the mercy of where they fall in the standings, then they should follow the blueprint of other David-led teams made in the past and surround Trae Young with an awesome defense. So how do they do that? I really don't know. If you're unfamiliar with the Hawks game, then let me educate you a little bit, dear viewer. And I'm sorry, Hawks fans, but I don't think this is an issue similar to what the Bucks had, where you can just point to one thing and say, hey, we just need to fix this and we'll be better. You guys have players that should be good defenders. Now, I will say the Hawks still need that bona fide point of attack defender. They were hoping DeJounte Murray would fill that role when they traded for him. And while he has been decent over these last 2 years, I don't think he's been close to what he was defensively in those early years in San Antonio. They also have a rookie, Kobe Buffkin, who's shown some promise on that end of the court, but he's still a bit raw, and I'm not quite sure if he's ready for heavy playoff minutes just yet. But still, even when taking into account this specific need, the Hawks should not be a bottom 5 defense in the league. There must be something else making this defense so bad that's a little harder to see. And when I watch Atlanta Hawks games, it just feels to me like it's a coaching thing. Not even scheme, just straight up coaching defensive effort. There are too many times when guys are late on rotations, or they aren't in the right position, or the defense just breaks down entirely for me to not have some questions about the coach. And I will say, even though Quinn Snyder may be well respected in the league as an offensive genius, I do think he has shown over his career he's a bit suspect on the defensive side of the ball. Now, I don't want to pin it all or even most of it on him, because the Hawks have been dealing with a lot of adversity this year, mainly in the form of injuries. If the injury bug hadn't hit Atlanta so hard, then the Hawks' key players would have a bit more playing time together, they'd have a bit more chemistry, and then maybe their defensive rotations and communication would be a little bit better. That definitely plays a factor, but it still doesn't account for the effort I and a lot of Atlanta Hawks fans see on a game-by-game basis. So how do the Hawks fix this? Well, I have 3 potential fixes, one that they may be able to implement this season, and 2 that they can implement in the offseason if the first change doesn't work out. The first potential fix: make DeJounte Murray into the player they were hoping for. Decrease his usage rating and shots per game, and increase Bogdanovich and Jalen Johnson's so that they all have about the same workload offensively. Hopefully that decrease in offensive workload will allow DeJounte to increase his defensive effort so he can at least partially return to that point of attack juggernaut that he was in his early years in San Antonio. If that is not enough though, which it probably won't be given how truly bad the Hawks defense is, it may be time to make another serious trade in the offseason and or make a change to the coaching staff. Let's start with the coaching staff take because it's the thing I have the least to say on. A lot of people more knowledgeable than me like Quinn Snyder, and I myself don't even think he's a bad coach either. I will say that my surround your small player with defensive specialist take extends to coaching as well. So if you don't like Quinn at all, getting a defensive coach in his stead may make your team a little more like the David-led teams of old. But a lot of people seem to like him, and I feel something similar to this scenario can be achieved through less drastic measures, i.e. doing something similar to what the Rockets did during the D'Antoni years and hire an assistant who will essentially be the defensive coordinator of the team. Finally, and most importantly, personnel. The previous two fixes are things the Hawks can do to make their defense not ass. But even if they do both of these things and they both work out to perfection, I do not think it'll be enough to raise the Hawks defense to the standards set by the small player-led teams we are comparing them to. To get to that top 5 in the league ranking, they need to improve their personnel in 3 specific ways. Point of attack defenders, which is only applicable if the DeJounte Murray fix doesn't work out. Center play, which may be able to be solved by just starting Onyeka Okongwu in Clint Capella's place. And finally, wing depth. No one that's gonna break the bank, but just someone you're fine with getting 10 to 15-ish minutes in the playoffs. Acquire players of those archetype, or really anyone that you think can bolster this porous defense and protect Trae Young, so that the Hawks can rely on him to carry them back to the Eastern Conference Finals. With that, thank you, dear viewer, for watching the video all the way through. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. We got videos coming to you each week around the middle of the week. Maybe not this next coming week because I am moving out right now, so I'm a little bit busy. But for the foreseeable future, you can expect videos from us about every week. Comment down below what you think about this video, what you think about this thought experiment, and if you think it's at all possible to build a championship team around Trae Young. And that's all I got. Stay sweaty, ladies and gentlemen.